Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back to another Chris Chan Cwiki reading, and not necessarily quick in the conventional sense, because, well, as we are going through Chris's psyche as far as these discussions are going, it's interesting to know of certain, conclusions I think some people have made in regards to the way Chris treats himself and will treat others. So, whether you want to say this is just a result of Chris being a dick to people just because he thinks it's funny, or if this is a part of something a bit darker, I think it's more the latter and it's a little bit more complex. But we'll be able to draw some more conclusions as this series goes on. So, Chris and manipulation. For every trolling saga, there was a bunch of stuff happening in the background. Chris's reactions on YouTube were highly inflated by troll girlfriends whispering shit to him behind the scenes. Oh Chris, you're not just gonna take that, are you? Chris, I need a man who can stand up for himself, not just a little wuss. It takes quite a bit to whip Chris up into a frenzy, and it's hard to keep it going. Mostly manipulated by Chris's laziness, vindictiveness, selfishness, self-immobilization, the electric hedgehog defensive state, etc., etc. This is the man in the pickle suit, Marvin, on how trolls manipulated Chris into performing in many of his rage videos. And that's a little bit shockingly accurate, unfortunately. I like the person who even did this. He did a good job. Something like 90% of what Chris to make the videos he did was never made public. Oh, according to Marvin. Manipulation, well, that's true because quite a lot of it did get leaked by, guess who else? The people that he sent the videos to. Manipulation is a psychological tactic aimed at taking advantage of someone in order for them to perform a specific action. This has been a key technique used by Chris's trolls, his enablers, and his own mother. Don't believe me? Well, look at that, and you're about to see for yourselves. Behind the scenes of trolling. Trolling is necessary for Chris to be as funny as everyone expects him to be. People don't like to hear this because they want to believe Chris is a crazy free-ring circus of fun 24/7. But he's really not. He's got his moments, but he's a phenomenon that now needs to be curated if you want to experience the old-school trolling days. Yeah, I literally, when the stuff about the incest calls began regarding Chris, it was a little bit far believing that this was not just the work of Clyde Cash. So if you really wanted to do back in the earlier days, you just make up something about one of his Solitude characters apparently being a bank manager or something like that, and Chris will fly off the handle about some ways to make this work, blah blah blah. One of Chris's former trolls, the man in the pickle suit, has often posted on Kiwi Farms describing how trolls manipulated Chris behind the scenes. Hundreds of hours worth of calls between Chris and the trolls took place, much of it never released. Information was also omitted on the Cwiki, which several trolls were members of. To paint a funnier picture of the Chris, a side effect of which has created a skewed impression of him to fans. Trolls would intentionally obscure their true identities, even from each other. And many would even change core details to further confuse those who seek to dox them. For example, Clyde Cash was originally meant to be a plain but successful Asian American guy, but this image was later replaced with a Guido stereotype, and everyone went along with it. In the background calls, people would plant ideas in Chris's head and goad him into making videos. One such example is Twin Falling Towers, a 2009 video in which Chris invoked the 9/11 tragedy to diss Clyde Cash. The man in the pickle suit described how the trolls talked to Chris behind the scenes to get him to make... I honestly thought Chris literally did that completely on his own, and it is literally about what you think it is, accompanied with a video of the Twin Towers itself. Be sure to mention that you think he's weak. Call him weak, like some sort of disaster. Like a bridge collapsing, or compare him to 9/11. That'll embarrass him. And Chris just thought to do that immediately. It even got Liquid Chris to even comment saying that, how could you make fun of the 9/11 terrorist attacks? And Chris received the backlash he received was so substantial that he had to make an apology video very half-assed, and he still tried to make a joke towards Clyde anyway, so he couldn't have just made it about being sorry, because it wasn't really about being sorry. Chris couldn't even be bothered to show his face in that video as well, so make of that what you will. For a decade or so, people assumed he came up with the 9/11 video of his own volition, painting an image of an unpatriotic ingrate. It didn't help that his apology video involved photoshopping the Twin Towers into candles, basically depicting the buildings on fire. Whether this apology video was staged or not is unknown. Later, Casey's father brought up the video in his infamous father call, claiming he had to dig his mother out of the tower's remains. Other examples include Quick calls out 3 naive YouTubers, a set of videos in which Chris lambasted fan Sonichu is cool. Trolls had planted the idea in his head that she was secretly a troll. That Chris just straight up believed, I guess. The Quixacle video in which he jammed his penis in the snow, and the Liquid Chris saga. Chris originally didn't want to react to Liquid, but the trolls forced his hand with artificial reasons. Also because there was a bird involved, which is usually a way to get Chris to react or acquiesce, because Chris sincerely thought that it was the wrong... whatever, it's a long story. Trolls exploited their knowledge of Chris's psychology to goad him into get angry in his videos. Chris usually reacts to a specific stimulus, has a short memory about those sorts of things, like a goldfish. So in any video where Chris is specifically trying to act like Johnny Bravo, that was almost always in response to a request by us no older than 24 hours. We would hype Chris up about how he's being called a pussy, and how if he doesn't make a video soon, he'll lose the rights to Sonichu. The difference in style between videos produced by trolls and videos Chris records on his own initiative supports the point. Trolls-produced videos tend to be short, succinct, and feature Chris making a fool of himself. Chris recording on his own tends to bore his audience by rambling about his interests like toys or his fantasy world. The Truman Show effect, as I call it. Chris's situation with the trolls has been compared to The Truman Show, a fictional film in which the main character is unaware he is living in a reality TV show, surrounded by improv actors, hidden cameras, and a conspiracy to hide the reality of a controlled environment. Chris's situation reflects Truman's, as he had been manipulated by trolls for the sole purpose of making him into a spectacle for online mockery, and many of his ostensibly private interactions have been unwittingly shared with the world. The only real difference is that Chris installed the cameras himself. Oh, and in case you wonder what this is, Surfshark Tito and another troll devised a new plan in which animators want to make a Sonichu cartoon in order to get him to write a script. So, what you might imagine, ladies and gentlemen, is that Chris would have been forced, but then again, would Chris have been interested if he immediately? I would have doubted it. Nor would I have ever suspected that people would have gone near Sonichu anyway, because who would? That's my point. Similar to how actors populate Truman's world while posing as trusted loved ones, Undercover Trolls posed as Chris's friends for years. They controlled access to Chris. When one sweetheart saga ended, another potential sweetheart would contact Chris, and he would ask his friends to vet them. The Undercover Trolls would confirm to Chris that the sweetheart could be trusted, thus continuing the cycle of trolling. One such undercover troll is the woman behind Emily, the Kim Wilson persona. Oh, and the Kim Wilson persona, and several other undisclosed personas. She lives locally to Chris, and she has met him in real life where she has gained his trust. Due to the severity of Chris's autism-related facial blindness, he was unable to recognize her face whenever she would meet him in town. She then exploited this weakness to trick Chris into believing he has multiple gal pals he can trust when, in reality, all are played by a single undercover troll. Though, to be fair, for Chris's antics involving actual dates or anything to go by, it probably would have been the best for people to have left well enough alone anyway. Boiling Frog Fable. In the years post-2011, Chris has become increasingly vulnerable of the concept of creeping normality, often represented through the fable of the boiling frog, which states that by slowly heating a pot of water with a frog inside to a boil, the frog will not recognize itself being cooked alive, as opposed to immediately tossing it in the boiling water, in which case it would quickly jump out. In a manner similar to the boiling frog, Chris is increasingly unable to recognize when he is the target of manipulation. I've heard about that sort of thing before, I've just never really known it in relation to Chris, but to be honest, it makes perfect sense. Without being told outright by others that said manipulation has taken place. In 2018, the idea guys manipulated Chris in ways darker than he had ever attempted before, including systematically dismantling his imaginary world and its cast of characters, engaging in criminal extortion against him, and accusing Chris of the P word. If he didn't play along with them, or see the overview section, Chris was gaslit to the point of completely believing everything the ideas guys said to him. While the efforts of the guard dogs minimally restored Chris's self-awareness to the point that he will level angry asides at the idea guy for the extortion in his videos, that never took place, as demonstrated in those during the Soft Exile saga, Chris still wholeheartedly believes in modifications the idea guys made to both the Sonichu canon and the real-world aspects of Chris's life. He appears from the outside to be no longer able to discern this normal life from which came before it, thus being affected by creeping normality. And it's so... What's kind of actually sad about the whole affair is that had Chris had any more level of self-awareness about what was really taking place, he would have changed his ways a lot sooner, and then... But because he hadn't, or maybe because he lacks the ability to do that, it might be too late even for that. Social engineering. Chris believes in crazy TV hacker stereotypes. That's why we always so easily told him we hacked into his phone or his email and blamed all our leaks on that. Our various troll girlfriends got away scot-free. And again, you know what, Marvin says this with absolute confidence, because at this point, is there any doubt as to how they managed to get away with it? Or rather, that they picked the right, or that Chris was so gullible that no matter what people said to him, Chris would have picked up, especially if it concerned him or his works and stuff like that. Trolls exploit Chris's naive nature to gain access to his accounts in order to leak emails or videos. After gaining Chris's trust via an internet persona, they would ask for access to Chris's accounts and blame the resulting trolling on hackers, and Chris would then change his password while simply handing the e-girlfriend/Sonichu character the new one since he still trusted them. This practice came to a farcical head during the Teen Troon Squad saga, when the Squad and Guard Dog factions engaged in a tug-of-war over Chris. The Squad, who would log into Chris's accounts and post information from Magi-chan about the Dimensional Merge, and the Guard Dogs. Also having Chris's passwords, why the hell Chris would even agree to do something like that? I mean, did he not think for 1 second that these people couldn't be trusted? Even for people I trusted, I wouldn't give my passwords out. That's just something you just don't do. Count it with their own information, trying to lead Chris away from thinking about the merge. This conflict caused confusion in Chris, who wanted to trust both sides. Blocking help. Marvin explained how the Miscreants group of trolls has isolated Chris from help. White Knights were subverted, their messages blocked, deleted before Chris could see them. If they got through, trolls would leak their conversations with Chris and accuse the helper of being the culprit. Trolls had a vice-like grip on Chris, and that only loosened when they willingly gave up when Bob died. But even if the conversion of who is or isn't a troll comes up with Chris, he's still not playing on level ground. Someone accuses Julie of being a troll, Julie says she's not a troll, who should Chris pick? What if it's 2 people saying Julie's not a troll? 3, 4? Some of Chris's IRL friends saying she's not a troll? Almost every person in his life? When people try to help Chris, he's not knowledgeable, throwing that help away. He cannot identify help. There's a platter with 20 different options, and one of those options is help. The rest are people trying to fuck him over. The numbers are not in favor of Chris. Which is, again, one of those things that's a little bit confusing just when you, read it, because why would Chris just not, put his pride aside for 1 second and actually decide, you know what, as bad as the situation is, I've got to somehow help myself in what happens. But because, as we know, Chris did not do any of those things, or he didn't even know where he could turn, your guess is as good as mine. And then the narrative that comes out later is, did Chris ever want any help? Or is Chris perfectly content as he is, and therefore we have to respect his wishes no matter if he's putting himself in harm's way or not? Which, for the most part, I think people just, that's the point where they decided to leave him enough alone. He could do a fantastic job of screwing himself over, so why even participate? Just watch from a distance. Chris in between the trolling. Without stimuli like the trolls goading him to get angry, Chris just kind of fell back into his natural state, being a man-child, playing with toys, and wanting his heart sweet to take care of him. Since his discovery by the internet in 2007, there have been times where activity fell to the point that Chris was temporarily without manipulation from trolls or enablers. Left to his own devices, Chris would drop off the internet and concentrate on the real world instead. Sometimes. We held him online. If someone's not actively compelling Chris to do stupid stuff online, he slides off. And yes, that was basically the whole point of part 38, where Chris, sort of being left to his own devices in the real world, finally realized that he didn't really have anyone to interact with at all. Chris experiencing anxiety and paranoia nearly a year after the classic troll conspirators released him from his Truman Show experience. From saying, is the person behind me a troll because they're looking at me, or just can he trust any of his friends that he still has on Facebook? An example of this can be seen in Chris's internet activity following his father's death. Yeah, exactly. At that point, the classic troll cabal voluntarily relinquished their control over Chris to allow him to grieve. As a direct result, Chris stopped recording wacky videos online, hence the abrupt end of the Calling Out saga. The troll experience has left Chris with lingering suspicion and paranoia as to the motives of others, and he has occasionally posted on social media channels about how he suspects people offline of being trolls, albeit without any real evidence. Chris gradually socialized in the real world again, such as hanging out at the Impulse Gay Social Club and with his Pokemon League friends. Although this respite was interspersed with the beginning of modern trolls such as Catherine and the Lady Managers, who, again, manipulated Chris back into his Truman Show existence. The business, financial crisis, and idea guy sagas were a paradigm shift from Chris's tendency to slide offline without troll influence to a new Chris increasingly online by his own volition. And then we move into Barb territory. Not in euphemism, by the way. Barb is often blamed for being Chris's original and most persistent enabler, and it is likely that her coddling gave Chris his penile and egocentric attitude. She is also deemed by Christorians to be the one responsible for Chris constantly taking orders from random strangers without giving it a second thought. In the past, some of Barb's attempts at controlling Chris were nothing short of outright emotional abuse. Examples include threatening to lock Chris out of the house and leave him homeless if he dared travel further than a few miles out of town after the Ohio trip, as well as feigning cardiac arrest to bring Chris into line, terrifying him to the point of calling 911 on several occasions. This would also be the point where, if Chris had any sense, he would have called social services and want to have barbed questions about these sorts of things. Perhaps the most, but then of course you may be arguing the case of, well, Chris would have been in his mid to late 20s at this point. Would social services? Well, yeah, they probably would. if it weren't also for the fact of Chris's online activities and stuff like that. Perhaps the most notable incident involving this sort of manipulation took back in 2011. Chris had planned to visit the year's Magfest convention, but realised he didn't have enough of his monthly tugboat left to afford a hotel room. So instead of opted, he slept in the car. After informing his parents of his plans, Barb gaslighted him into backpedaling, firstly by claiming he could be at risk from a combination of criminals and cold temperatures, then again by threatening to leave him homeless, and finally by implying that she would commit suicide. If Chris went to the convention, a distraught Chris cancelled his plans and received only further guilt-tripping and a video game as consolation. Bad Bob. Bad Bob. Manipulation techniques. Pro tip. The methods listed here are for documenting common techniques used by trolls. Do not attempt any of these. As shown above, after gaining Chris's trust, it isn't particularly difficult to get him to do many things he wouldn't normally do. There is a 3-step process that most trolls and enablers use. 1. Appeasement. Give Chris an offer for something he'd really want or feed into Chris's beliefs. 2. Instructions. Provide Chris with over-the-top steps he can take to the offer or so that he can roleplay with you. 3. Betrayal. Watch him do it and betray him. Then watch the result of said betrayal. Rinse, dry, and repeat. As an example, Chris's history of being manipulated began with him being tricked into crawling into a tight space by childhood friend Sarah Hammer, when she told him that she found Casper the friendly ghost there. Sarah simply noticed that Chris had a fascination with cartoon characters being real, and knew that this was the perfect opportunity to give Chris the offer of meeting him in person. Appeasement. She then told him that he could see Casper if he crawled into the hole. Instructions. And finally, she locked him in, and began watching the events that would follow. Betrayal. And it's fascinating as well, they literally do go over all of this, so let's do the same, eh? During the classic era, this technique would be used by many trolls such as Blanca Weiss, Clyde Cash, Liquid Chris, and even a bunch of trolls posing as Nintendo staff. In the case of Blanca, the trolls behind the pseudonym simply realized that Chris wanted a significant other to complete his love quest, and finally get some china. So they used Chris's desperate pleas to complete this mission to obtain his medallions. Appeasement. Afterwards, they insisted that Chris give them the medallion if he wanted Blanca for himself. Instructions. Finally, they destroy the medallion in many ways, from cutting it with a knife and hitting it with a hammer, to setting it on fire and submerging the broken pieces into a jar of pickles. Betrayal. The most illegal and life-changing use of this technique to date is from Chris's most infamous enablers, the Idea Guys. After a long string of supernatural beliefs and creepy behaviours being displayed from Chris during his comeback, a troll by the name of Joshua Wise noticed his complete lack of self-awareness and wanted to see how deep the rabbit hole would go. Wise would then appeal to many of Chris's fantasies by role-playing as several of his characters. Appeasement. Afterwards, he tasked him to do a number of nonsensical tasks, such as having him lick a drawing of Magi-chan's penis on a wall and having him destroy a Christmas tree, telling him it was Nazi merchandise. Instructions. The betrayal part of this would come from the proposed humiliation that Chris would subject himself to. Even after, he was doxxed and shut down for a while, along with several others, would use this technique repeatedly until they went as far as extorting large sums of money from him and falsely reporting him to the FBI for being the P-word, among other things. Betrayal. A less common means that people have found to manipulate him is through the same process but in reverse. This method is a favourite among his mother. Threats. Tell Chris that if he does or does not do something, you will do something undesirable that will happen to him. Instructions. Tell him that, in order to prevent the undesirable thing from happening, he has to cancel all plans and instead take part of someone else's whims, and reward him for doing what he has been told to do in further strengthening his trust in you. Or you can just betray him anyway. Rinse, dry, repeat. They're all fucked up, and don't ever do any of them. That's all I'm going to say about that. Validation. Some manipulation involves giving Chris validation over his pre-existing feelings and beliefs, which influences him further. Examples include the unknown enabler who told him to get in touch with his feminine side and influenced him into identifying as a tomgirl, the subliminal frequency hypnosis videos, and the people who commented in them, who influenced Chris into believing his taint was transforming into a vagina, and the idea guys, who exploited his beliefs about alternative dimensions in order to influence and shape those beliefs further, culminating in Chris's pseudo-religious belief over the dimensional merge. Reasons as to why Chris is so gullible. Mental deficiencies. A common aspect of autism spectrum conditions is an increased level of gullibility. Those on the spectrum are often more openly trusting of others, willing to put aside suspicion to follow what someone says. Even in situations which could put them at risk, Chris also appears to have some degree of both facial blindness and difficulty recognizing voices, which are also common, though not universal, autism symptoms. Sad but true. Chris has been fooled by numerous personas operated by the same person. An example of this is Chris wholeheartedly believing the person behind the Jack Thaddeus persona in the Calling Out saga to be Ahuvia Harel, even though the two neither sounded nor looked alike, as well as Chris believing Kim Wilson to be a different person from Emily, even though the latter presented herself to Chris as the former on several occasions, and Chris did not pick this up one bit. Even in face-to-face meetings where Chris should have been able to tell the difference, he had not been experiencing this impaired recognition. Furthermore, Julie was a 13-year-old boy using an obvious falsetto voice, yet Chris believed her to sound 100% female, even when the actor forgot to mask his voice. Enablers and lack of independence. Chris isn't very independent. He relies on the government and his mother to pay their bills, and still ends up in debt. While he has made real-life friends in the past, the Idea Guy saga led him to alienate them in mid-2018. Nowadays, he prefers to surround himself with online enablers and play into his every escapist fantasy, in turn gaining his trust. Chris's dependence on other people, especially his enablers, has actually made him more susceptible or being manipulated, as all of his trust is simply put into them without any second thoughts. He is also highly susceptible to peer pressure and fitting in with others' opinions. Chris's gullible, overly trusting nature and desire for contact means that he has often been drawn to consider others friends, even if they're acquaintances, at best, or simply attempting to get close for malicious reasons at worst. Even though he would often curse and even wish death on trolls, in recorded voice chats with them, he would often appear to be quite receptive and active in such conversations, as long as the others did not cross the hurtful truth level, in which case he would become hostile in return. From an outsider's perspective, Chris's isolation has also resulted in him making vulnerable to manipulation techniques, as a result of his attempts at seeking out people beyond the horde-choked halls of 14 Branch Lane Court. His lack of self-awareness. Chris lacks self-awareness and a sense of boundaries. Whether for himself or for others, he has no filter, a trait which he calls honesty. He will tell you embarrassing private matters when you first meet him, including his former virginity, his story about how Pink Eye gave him differently coloured eyes, and even his tendency to soil himself. Once someone gains his trust, he will reveal even more personal information, sometimes literally just on a whim, most of which an average person wouldn't even reveal to a psychologist. Trolls collate the information and leak it to the public, where it ends up on forums, YouTube videos, and, well, like this one, and this fine wiki. This lack of self-awareness may also be another symptom of his autism. Usually this manifests as generally innocuous things, like being unable to regulate the volume of one's voice to match the social setting, or being unable to recognize non-verbal social cues when communicating with other people. In more severe cases like Chris, however, his lack of social awareness can come across as tone deaf at best, or a threat to one's safety at worst. Normally, this lack of self-awareness in a social sense can be minimalized or outright cured with the proper resources, e.g. special education and the right therapist. But we all know how well that turned out. Not very well. His self-entitlement. Another massive flaw that makes Chris easy to manipulate is his egotism. Something we'll be able to discuss a lot more in detail when it comes to Chris and his ego, because it is so inflamed that it's going to burn down his house again. And resulting entitlement. So long as he takes a procedure or simply whines about it long enough. Many of the cases where he had been manipulated involved the manipulator noticing this fundamental character flaw and therefore bribing him with gifts and promises of self-fulfillment. The bribes could be anything from promises of romance to a video game publishing deal. As long as it's something Chris wants, trolls will use it as bait. However, this also has a tendency to backfire, as Chris always believes he is entitled to more and will take a gift and then turn around and ask for another. So yeah, you play into it, and it plays into more like of a sense of his like I said, his lack of self-awareness and playing into things that he will want, and you just goad him like, you know, the old donkey and carrot technique, and that's how you goad Chris into just doing things that he knows fine well he probably shouldn't. It's so easy to do, but yeah. General short-sightedness. Chris repeatedly falls victim to the super straight effect, where someone will provide a quick rebuttal to a point and lose ground to the wider argument. In Super Straight's case, they inevitably corroborated the claims that trans women are women by creating a separate sexuality than straight for those who aren't attracted to them. Likewise, Chris will regularly talk himself into various corners by agreeing to various outlandish claims merely because he was pressured to accept certain points as fact to continue the conversation. This is how you can get him to finally admit Liquid's true and honest name is Chris and not Jeff, then Chris Chandler, then Kristen Weston Chandler. But he was given that name and not renamed by an animatronic bear, and so on, theoretically, forever. And so that actually concludes Chris's article on manipulation. And what strikes me as very, very interesting is that not only that it works too well, especially on someone like Chris, but also for the fact that time and time again, these are the sorts of things that should have been avoided, could have been avoided, and if Chris had any sense at the back of his mind, knows fine well that he could have just put all of this behind him and we wouldn't even be having this conversation anyway. But like I said, because Chris chose not to do any of these things is the reason why the way he is. If he just learned to grow up, if he just learned to be different, to learn from his mistakes, then, like I said, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But, like I said before, because he didn't, he didn't. And because I did, I am. And there we go. So I hope all of you guys have enjoyed this reaction video to, reading Chris's manipulation Cwiki entry. And I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.